March 1945. The Pacific Ocean is no longer blue. From the horizon to the reefs of Okinawa, smoke hangs in a dirty gray sheet over the Ryukyu Islands. Beneath it moves the largest invasion fleet in human history, minus 1,300 American ships, 183,000 troops, and an enemy that has stopped fighting to win. Japan now fights to die. The kamikaze era has begun. In the weeks before the landings, the Imperial Japanese Navy dissolves the last remnants of its power into the sky. Pilots trained not for combat, but for collision. Airfields from Kyushu to Formosa are stripped of conventional bombers. Everything that can carry fuel and a 500-kilogram bomb is reassigned to special attack duty. By early April, the U.S. Navy knows something is different. Radar picket, destroyers light, fast ships, posted far from the main fleet to give early warning, start disappearing. A single attack can send one down in seconds. The first hits tear apart ships like Bush and Colhoun, burning their crews alive in fuel-fed infernos. Doctrine says destroyers can absorb 1 or 2 hits and fight on. Doctrine has never seen pilots who turn themselves into bombs. At sea level, aboard ships like the USSLAFFEY Squadro, survival becomes a race between flame and pressure. Every destroyer has one lifeline, a single hypersure main that runs the length of the hull, feeding water to hydrants on every deck. When that line is ruptured, fire crews lose everything. In Okinawa, ruptures are not rare. Kamikaze impacts rip through decks, bulkheads, and piping at once. The manual says to isolate the section, vent the smoke, and continue fire suppression. But the manual assumes the ship still exists. By the second week of April, more than a dozen destroyers have been lost to internal fires alone. Some never make it to the bottom. They are abandoned, burning from boat to stern. The waterline melts from within. In Washington, engineers blame poor welding, old fittings, fatigue. In the fleet, the men know better. The design works in theory, not in flame. Among them is machinist's mate, second-class William E. Carter, a mechanic aboard a damaged destroyer tender near Karamaretto. He's not an officer, not a naval architect, not even on the ship's command roster. But Carter has watched 2 ships die in front of him, both because their fire mains failed. His idea is simple. Add a bypass, a secondary loop that could reroute water around ruptured sections, keeping pressure alive for the pumps aft. The materials exist on board: spare valves, flexible hose, sections of pipe from cooling systems. He writes a proposal, rough but clear, and sends it through his division chief. Days later, the reply comes back stamped in red, not authorized. Modification outside Bureau of Ships specification. To Carter, it means nothing. To the Navy, it means the system can't be standardized, documented, or insured. Field improvisation invites chaos, and chaos on a warship means death. But the war has already descended into chaos. By late April, U.S. naval losses reach levels unseen since Pearl Harbor. Kamikazes are hitting with mathematical precision, over 1,900 attacks in 1 month. 40 ships are sunk, hundreds damaged. The Navy's Bureau of Ships receives flood reports from Okinawa, describing multiple mechanical casualties due to blast severance of primary mains. In plain English, the fire lines keep breaking. On the front, men stop waiting for orders. Sailors in the forward engineering sections begin cutting, welding, and rerouting. Some install manual valves where none existed. Others run improvised hoses through ventilation trunks to feed auxiliary pumps. Crews on Laffey, Hadley, Pringle, and Ammon build secondary systems behind their officers' backs. The Navy doesn't know it yet, but a new doctrine, damage control as we know it today, is being written in those engine rooms. On April 7th, the battle for Okinawa enters its deadliest phase. Japanese pilots launch Operation Tengo, the largest coordinated suicide attack of the war. 355 kamikazes, 341 bombers, 58 fighters, all aimed at the American fleet. The battleship Yamato, the pride of Japan, sails to her death as a decoy. For the men on the destroyers, there is no glory, only smoke. At 9:30 a.m., radar pickets detect incoming waves. The first hits destroy the Bush, breaking her in two. 15 minutes later, Colquhoun follows. Menort Elabil, a veteran of Lady Gulf, is struck by a rocket-assisted kamikaze and vaporized midship. The crew barely has time to signal abandon ship. Each explosion teaches the same lesson. One hit is not fatal. Two might be. The fire that follows is. In Washington, reports pile up. Water mains severed at frame 90. Secondary pump inaccessible. Fire spread uncontrolled to aft magazine. The phrases repeat, line after line. Behind them lie hundreds of deaths. Men who suffocated, burned, or drowned in their own firefighting water. And yet, mixed within the disaster reports, a few anomalies appear. Destroyers hit in multiple locations, but still operational. Ships with hull ruptures, but intact pressure systems. Investigators can't explain it, but the reason sits below deck, in the form of a welded steel elbow that wasn't supposed to exist. Carter's rejected idea has already spread. By April 10th, sailors across the Okinawa fleet are quietly modifying their ships. The auxiliary lines keep the pressure stable, even after catastrophic hits. Foam pumps, meant for hangar decks, are rerouted to the main battery compartments. Crews start stockpiling pre-mixed foam barrels near the gun mounts, against regulation. Every one of these changes breaks the book. Every one saves lives. When the Bureau of Ships finally investigates weeks later, they find dozens of destroyers with identical modifications, none of them authorized, all of them effective. The Navy calls it unofficial adaptation under combat conditions. History will call it ingenuity under fire. In April's heat, the sea turns to a furnace. The destroyers on radar picket duty become floating targets, each manned by fewer than 300 souls, each facing hundreds of incoming aircraft. And deep in those steel halls, amid the whine of pumps and the hiss of leaking steam, an unrecognized truth takes shape. The fleet no longer survives because of orders. It survives because of people who break them. April 1945. Above deck, the war is noise and flame. Below deck, it is silence, broken only by the hiss of steam and the sound of boots on hot steel. The men who fight here do not fire guns. They fight time, temperature, and fear. They are called damage control, though few outside the fleet know their names. Firemen, machinists, mates, electricians, the invisible crew who keep the ship breathing after the first hit. When the alarms sound, the gunners run to their stations. Damage control runs toward the smoke. Every destroyer has a team, but at Okinawa, every man becomes one. Kamikaze attacks leave no time for orders. A plane hits, bulkheads rupture, and seconds decide everything. In training manuals, damage control is methodical: isolate, contain, extinguish. In Okinawa, it's instinct, panic, and improvisation. USSLAFFEY sits on radar picket station No. 1, 30 miles north of Okinawa. The air smells like gasoline and salt. Commander Frederick Beckton has ordered triple fire drills per week since commissioning. The crew can fight fire blindfolded. They will need to. At 8:30 a.m. on April 16th, the first radar contact appears. 12 bogies inbound. Within minutes, the ship is surrounded by aircraft. 22 kamikazes attack in less than 90 minutes. Bombs strike the stern, the bridge, the aft deckhouse. The sky becomes liquid fire. When the main fire line bursts amidships, it should have been the end. Every manual says a destroyer cannot survive once its pressure system collapses, but Beckton's crew had modified theirs. Against regulation, they had run an auxiliary hose circuit aft. Carter's idea, born far from this ship, now copied by men who never knew his name. Water pressure holds. Foam still flows. Fire teams advance into smoke thick enough to suffocate. The decks tremble as 2 more planes hit. Ammunition cooks off like thunder. Still, the hoses spit water. Still, the pumps breathe. Laffey does not die. 200 miles away, another destroyer learns the same lesson. USS Bush, hit 3 times in 10 minutes, burns from bow to stern. The fire line snaps, pressure gone. Within minutes, flames reach the magazines. The ship explodes, taking 94 men with it. No auxiliary line, no second chance. By the 3rd week of April, the pattern is clear. Ships that follow the book die with the book. Ships that break it live. For the men below deck, there is no strategy, no grand tactic, only seconds. A plane hits, lights die, the world becomes black and red. They crawl through heat so intense it melts paint off the walls. Hoses burst, airlines leak. They plug holes with rags, clamp pipes with belts, pump water from one flooded compartment into another just to keep the ship balanced. The sound of oxygen bottles bursting is like gunfire. The smell of burning insulation is everywhere. One survivor from the Hadley later said, "You don't fight the ship, you fight the fire, and the fire fights you back." Official Navy reports mention the weapons, the tactics, the aircraft types. They rarely mention the temperature of steel at 900 degrees Fahrenheit, or how water turns to steam before it hits the wall. They never mention how men learn to breathe through wet towels, or how skin blisters just by touching the deck. But that's where the war is won. In compartments no camera ever filmed. By mid-April, word spreads through the fleet. Don't wait for orders. Fix what's broken. On Laffey, sailors use spare aircraft fuel hoses to patch the main. On Hadley, they use engine coolant pumps as emergency pressure boosters. On Amnon, they cut holes in bulkheads to run hoses straight through, ignoring ship design entirely. Each act violates procedure. Each one saves a ship. Rear Admiral Calvin Durgin, commander of the escort carrier group, receives a stack of after-action reports that make no sense. Ships struck multiple times, yet still afloat. Systems operating that should have been dead. He sends a message to the Bureau of Ships in Washington. Recommend immediate review of field modifications observed in the Okinawa area. Evidence suggests major effectiveness. The Bureau of Ships replies a week later with a single line. Unauthorized structural changes, not recommended for permanent adoption. It is the language of peace. The men in Okinawa are living a different war. The USSLAFFEY spends that night covered in smoke, her decks pitted with craters, her guns melted, her hull scarred, but she floats. The Japanese radio later calls her the ship that would not die. In Washington, no one yet understands why. The men of damage control sleep in shifts, if at all. They wake to the smell of diesel and rubber, their uniforms stiff with salt and sweat. Some can't hear anymore. The blast waves have shattered their eardrums. Others have burns hidden under their sleeves. They do not call themselves heroes. They call it the job. One machinist mate writes in his log that night, "We fixed the fire line again today. Used an oil hose from the engine room. Not standard issue, but it worked. Maybe we'll tell them later." He never does. In the eyes of history, victories are measured in ships sunk and enemies defeated. But at Okinawa, survival itself is a victory. For every destroyer that goes down, another floats because men in the dark refuse to follow the book. When the last fires fade, the ships that endure have one thing in common: the unofficial system. The bypass, the hoses no one approved. A mechanic's idea, rejected in Washington, becomes gospel at sea. In war, great innovations rarely begin in laboratories. They begin in silence, in the hum of engines, the clang of steel, the rhythm of men who have run out of options. By the spring of 1945, the U.S. Navy's technical offices were flooded with reports from Okinawa. Each one followed the same pattern: fire main severed, power lost, ship abandoned. Each one ended the same way: recommend reinforcement of existing systems. And yet, among those dry paragraphs, a handful of odd reports appeared. Ships struck in multiple compartments that did not sink. Fires contained without main pressure. Vessels surviving conditions that should have killed them. The reports offered no technical explanation. Officially, they shouldn't have been possible. The truth was simple. Sailors had stopped asking permission. On dozens of destroyers, mechanics, welders, and machinists, mates, began building what Washington had dismissed: an auxiliary fire main. The logic was primitive but perfect. If the primary line failed, water could still circulate through a bypass loop connected to secondary pumps. They built it with scrap, steel, and aircraft fittings, sealing leaks with cloth gaskets, and welding with shipboard torches meant for hull repair. The modifications were crude, uneven, often dangerous. But when the first planes hit, they worked. The men didn't know that a similar idea had already been submitted months before. They didn't know the name of the machinist who wrote it. All they knew was that someone had thought this through and that the Bureau of Ships had said no. Inside the engineering division of the Bureau in Washington, safety was sacred. Unauthorized modifications were chaos. Every ship a unique experiment. Consistency meant control, and control meant survival. To the men at Okinawa, the opposite was true. The destroyer Laffey's survival had already raised questions. Now reports from Hadley and Kasson showed the same patterns. Each had used non-standardized piping, auxiliary pump routing, field reconfiguration. None of those terms appeared in the manual. And yet, each of those ships was still afloat. Rear Admiral Calvin Durgin, reading the after-action summaries, saw a pattern no one else wanted to see. He wrote in his personal notebook, "There is intelligence in the chaos. The fleet is teaching itself to survive faster than we can write it down." On the destroyer, USS Hadley, Commander Baron Milani ordered his crew to expect to lose everything once. It wasn't defeatism, it was preparation. His chief machinist, a man named George Rutledge, had installed backup lines from the bilge pumps to the main fire headers. Using valves scavenged from the ship's coolant system, he never told headquarters. On May 11, 1945, Hadley faced its reckoning. 22 Japanese aircraft dove at her within 90 minutes. The ship's guns shredded many, but 5 made it through. Each impact tore away another system: electrical, hydraulic, steering. When the primary water main burst at frame 120, Rutledge's makeshift line kicked in. Water flowed where it shouldn't have been able to. Firefighters in soaked uniforms dragged hoses through smoke and darkness, their faces hidden behind rags soaked in seawater. The auxiliary pumps held until the last fire died. Hadley was crippled, half sunk, but alive. When repair crews later boarded her, they found the illegal piping system still in place, welded by hand, functional, perfect. The engineers back in Washington called it field improvisation. The sailors called it common sense. But for the men who lived it, the bypass system was more than a technical solution. It was a rebellion, a quiet defiance of distance, paperwork, and fear. Every man who welded a pipe against orders risked court-martial. But every ship that used one lived long enough to tell the tale. The Navy did not move quickly. It never does. But the data could not be ignored. In late June 1945, the Bureau of Ships issued a memo titled Recommendations for Temporary Damage Control, Adaptations in Forward Areas. The language was cautious, bureaucratic, and incomplete. But between the lines, something extraordinary appeared. Field modifications have demonstrated exceptional utility under fire. Commanding officers are authorized to conduct necessary rerouting of auxiliary systems for preservation of life and ship integrity. No credit was given, no names listed. The mechanic's idea, once rejected, was now official policy. The lesson was not lost on those who survived. Commander Becton of Laffey later wrote, "Doctrine is written in ink. Survival is written in flame." Every ship that returned from Okinawa carried scars that told the same story: scorched plating, melted fittings, patchwork steel. But deep within their hulls, behind the chaos and the carbon, was something new: redundancy. For the first time in naval history, destroyers could fight after their fire mains failed. It's easy to forget how revolutionary that was. Before 1945, naval survival depended on discipline and order. You followed the book, or you died by it. The Kamikaze War changed that forever. It turned the sea into a laboratory where mistakes meant death and innovation meant life. A mechanic's rejected blueprint, born of desperation, forced an entire fleet to evolve. By the time the war ended, the auxiliary fire main system was quietly included in the next edition of the Damage Control Manual. It carried no author, no patent, no citation. But the men who built it didn't need recognition. They already had proof in the ships that came home. In the months that followed, engineers at the Mare Island and Puget Sound shipyards studied the Okinawa survivors. They found a pattern so consistent it became statistical truth. Ships with redundant firefighting lines survive 60% more kamikaze hits than those without. Numbers do not tell stories, but these did, because behind every percentage point was a man who refused to let regulation decide his fate. April 16, 1945. 8:25 a.m. The sea is flat and deceptive. On the horizon, radar picks up the first contacts, faint blips growing into waves of light. The men aboard USSLAFFEY DD 724 tighten their helmets, adjust their gloves, and wait. At 8:30, the first kamikazes appear. Not one or two, 22. Laffey is alone on radar picket station 1, 30 miles north of Okinawa. She was built to detect, not to endure. Her mission, warn the fleet. Her fate, survive the impossible. Commander Frederick Julian Beckton, standing on the bridge, doesn't raise his voice. He never does. We'll fight her as long as she floats, he says, a phrase that will later become part of naval legend. But at that moment, it's not legend. It's math minus 347 men against the largest suicide assault ever aimed at a single destroyer. The first dive comes from the sun, a Zero carrying a 250-kilogram bomb. The gunners fire everything they have, 5-inch, 40 millimeters, 20 millimeters. The plane vanishes in a cloud of flame 200 yards out. The crew cheers. The radar still shows 21 more. Seconds later, 2 more planes break through. One slams into the aft deckhouse, igniting stored ammunition. Another crashes into the port side just above the waterline, rupturing pipes, tearing through the main fire main. Pressure drops instantly. For most ships, this is the end. But Laffey isn't most ships. Her crew had quietly installed redundant lines, auxiliary hoses, and emergency valves, unauthorized, unofficial, and life-saving. Within moments, water is rerouted through the auxiliary loop. The aft pumps keep running. Foam sprays hold the flames down. Firefighters crawl through smoke, opening valves by hand while molten metal rains from the deck above. The ship doesn't stop firing. At 8:48 a.m., another Zero crashes into the bridge. The blast throws men across the deck. Shrapnel cuts through the radar antenna. Commander Beckton's cap flies off. He gets back up, blood on his face, and orders, "Keep those guns firing. We're not going anywhere." Down below, the machinist's mates are doing the same, refusing to stop. The forward engine room is flooding. Seawater pours through ruptured bulkheads. Damage control parties seal hatches, pump water by hand, and reroute power cables to keep the gun turrets alive. The temperature reaches 850 degrees Fahrenheit in the forward compartments. Paint blisters, ammunition shells glow red. But the hoses don't stop. By 9:05, Laffey has been hit by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs. The Japanese pilots are relentless, some burning, still steering, determined to die with accuracy. One plane skims the ocean, its wings clipping the waves before smashing into the aft gun mount. Another hits the mast, exploding mid-air and showering the deck with burning fuel. Everywhere, the ship bleeds, water, fire, men, the deck tilts, the rudder jams, but the crew refuses to abandon ship. From the engine room comes a voice over the intercom. "Fire control is still online. We can give you water if you can give us power. The response? We'll give you both." The battle becomes a contest of endurance. Anti-aircraft gunners reload with their bare hands, skin blistering against molten barrels. The smell of cordite and salt fills the air. At 9:20, another bomber dives, hits dead center, explodes. The concussion knocks out the main switchboard. Lights die. Power fails. In the dark, electricians run cables through smoke-filled compartments, bypassing burned circuits with emergency wires. The pumps restart within minutes. The fire hoses come back to life. Against every probability, Laffey is still fighting. 9:45 a.m. The attack finally slows. The sky is filled with burning wreckage. The sea is black with oil. The radar scope, once alive with enemy echoes, now shows silence. 32 sailors are dead. 71 are wounded. But the ship still floats. The crew fights fire for another 4 hours, refusing relief until every ember is gone. The auxiliary hoses, welded, improvised, forbidden, have held. When tugboats arrive to tow her back to Okinawa, the rescuers cannot believe what they see. Laffey's aft guns still point toward the sky. Her decks are cratered, her antennas melted, her hull smoking, but she is alive. Later, when the Navy's investigation boards ask how she survived, Becton answers simply, training luck, and a few things the Bureau didn't approve. The board doesn't press further. They have the proof in front of them. Weeks later, when Laffey limps into the repair yard, engineers examine her systems. They find the auxiliary lines welded from scrap, bolted through bulkheads, fed by auxiliary pumps, each one functional, each one used during battle. One report, stamped confidential, concludes, unauthorized engineering modifications resulted in sustained firefighting capability. Recommendation, study for possible future adoption. In the next edition of the Navy Damage Control Manual, the auxiliary fire main appears for the first time, unnamed, uncredited, but real. The Japanese press later calls Laffey the ship that would not die. To her crew, she was something else. Proof that survival comes from the men who work, not the men who write. Becton would retire a rear admiral in 1966. He kept a piece of Laffey's scorched steel on his desk until the day he died. In an interview years later, when asked what saved his ship, he didn't mention weapons, armor, or tactics. He said only one word, preparation. The war was nearly over, but the Pacific didn't know it yet. Okinawa still burned. Japan still sent pilots, with no return flight plan. And the men of the U.S. Navy still fought every wave, every dawn, every alarm. Yet beneath the chaos, something had shifted, not in the enemy, but in the fleet itself. For the first time, the U.S. Navy's greatest weapon wasn't its carriers, or its guns, or its admirals. It was adaptation. The lessons of the destroyers of Laffey, Hadley, Cassin, and Bush began to move through the fleet like whispers. Ships talked to ships. Crews exchanged blueprints, sketches, and scrawled diagrams of emergency rerouting. It wasn't official doctrine. It was survival passed hand to hand. By June 1945, repair tenders at Ulithi and Caramaretto had entire workshops devoted to copying the field modifications discovered on the battered destroyers. Welders rebuilt auxiliary lines exactly as they had been improvised in battle. Same layout, same valves, same redundancy. When inspectors arrived from Washington, they were stunned. Every shipyard in the Pacific was using the same unauthorized ideas. What had begun as rebellion was now policy in motion. At Pearl Harbor, where the Pacific Fleet had first burned 4 years earlier, naval engineers studied the wrecked ships that limped home from Okinawa. They examined heat warping, hull buckling, and pressure line failures. But one detail kept repeating. Wherever sailors had installed a bypass, any bypass, the damage stopped spreading, a pattern no statistician could ignore. The Bureau of Ships, now under pressure from Admiral Nimitz himself, ordered an internal report titled Analysis of Improvised Damage Control Systems, Pacific Theater, 1945. Its conclusion was blunt. Existing fire main design insufficient against multiple compartment rupture. Recommend adoption of secondary routed pressure lines, auxiliary pumping, and foam distribution redundancy. It was the language of revolution, written in the calm vocabulary of engineers. Meanwhile in Tokyo, Japanese war planners were learning a very different lesson. By May, the Imperial Navy had effectively ceased to exist. The kamikazes had cost Japan nearly 5,000 pilots, many barely trained, most never seeing their target. But what truly broke their strategy wasn't lack of will. It was the resilience of their enemy. The destroyers that were supposed to sink kept surviving. Each battle report describing enemy ship not destroyed was more than a loss. It was a psychological blow. By July, the Imperial Japanese Navy's final analysis called the U.S. fleet mechanically immortal, a myth born from smoke and fire, and from one mechanic's rejected idea. The war's last months were mechanical hell. Okinawa cost the U.S. Navy 36 ships, sunk, and 368 damaged, many beyond repair. But thanks to redundancy and improved firefighting, nearly 90% of attacked ships stayed afloat long enough for rescue or repair. The human cost was unbearable, More than 4,900 sailors killed by kamikazes. But for every name carved into bronze, a dozen others lived because the fleet had learned to evolve faster than it could be destroyed. The USS Hadley returned to port weeks after Laffey. Her decks were scorched black, her engines crippled, her guns twisted by heat. Yet she floated, a miracle of stubbornness and engineering. Naval engineers inspecting the ship found the same welded bypasses and jury-rigged foam systems that had saved Laffey. One officer from the Bureau of Ships noted dryly, "This configuration does not conform to Navy standards, yet appears to have prevented total loss, the understatement of a generation." From those field notes, the Navy rewrote the rules. By the end of 1945, Damage Control Central became a permanent command structure aboard all U.S. warships. New blueprints included dual fire mains, auxiliary pumps, and automatic shutoff valves, direct descendants of the Okinawa improvisations. Even the foam changed. The early, sticky, short-range formulas were replaced with high-expansion mixtures designed for rapid deck coverage. The ancestors of today, SAFF aqueous film-forming foam systems. Every improvement had a bloodline, and it led back to that same moment, a mechanic drawing an idea no one wanted. When the war ended, few remembered the men who fought the fires. The world celebrated the pilots, the admirals, the victories, but inside the Navy, in the quiet corridors of its technical bureaus, engineers knew the truth. The fleet had survived not because of command, but because of courage. Admiral Nimitz himself wrote a post-war memo to the Bureau of Ships, stating, "In combat, initiative is life, regulation is death. Preserve the spirit of the fleet." Those words were never made public. They didn't need to be. They became policy by silence. The Laffey and Hadley were decommissioned, their hulls preserved as testaments to endurance. Decades later, when museum curators opened the sealed compartments of the Laffey, they found the same auxiliary fire line still intact, welded by hand, still functional, still alive. Visitors today walk her decks unaware that they're standing on the birthplace of modern naval safety. They see guns and flags. They don't see the pipes that saved her. But those who know the sailors, the engineers, the quiet men of steel, never forgot. By the time the Cold War began, the doctrine of redundancy was sacred. Every new ship carried it. Every generation of sailors learned it. Because once, long ago, on a burning sea near Okinawa, one mechanic refused to let the rules decide who lived. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, the Pacific smelled of smoke and salt. The ships that returned were ghosts of themselves, twisted steel, blistered paint, names carved by flame. Yet they floated. They had survived what they were never built to face. To the Navy, that fact alone demanded explanation. The Bureau of Ships began its most ambitious post-war study, a full audit of every U.S. vessel struck by kamikazes. It wasn't about medals or glory. It was about understanding why some ships lived when others didn't. The data was staggering. Between October 1944 and the war's end, over 1,900 kamikaze attacks had been launched. 57 ships sank. More than 400 were damaged, but the majority somehow endured. And as engineers pored over wreckage, battle reports, and deck logs, one truth emerged. The ships that survived had all broken the rules. They found secondary lines welded from scrap, backup pumps rigged from fuel systems, foam canisters placed near gun mounts instead of in lockers. Every one of these violations matched with a ship that had made it home. The report's lead author, Commander Robert H. Taggart, summed it up in a single sentence: "The fleet saved itself faster than we could instruct it." For a military built on hierarchy, that was a quiet revolution. In Washington, the conclusions were uncomfortable. The manuals, the sacred texts of naval engineering, were obsolete. The fleet had rewritten them in battle without permission. So, in late 1945, a new philosophy began to take shape within the Bureau of Ships. Doctrine by experience. It meant that procedure was no longer sacred. It meant that a young machinist who found a better way to fight fire could change the way ships were built. It meant that every spark of improvisation, every scrap welded pipe, every desperate act of survival could become standard Navy design. By 1946, the first experimental post-war destroyers incorporated lessons from Okinawa. They carried dual fire mains, redundant pumps, and integrated foam systems, innovations born not in labs, but in infernos. A confidential memo titled Lessons from Fleet Improvisation circulated through the shipyards of Mare Island, Norfolk, and Bremerton. Its language was simple but radical. Future vessels shall integrate localized control, distributed firefighting, and redundant routing for all essential systems. Translated into plain English, never let one hit kill a ship again. While engineers formalized the doctrine, the sailors who had lived it faded quietly into peacetime. Commander Frederick Julian Beckton, the man who refused to abandon the Laffey, returned to training command, where he built programs that forced young officers to think, not just follow orders. In one recorded lecture, he told a room of new ensigns, "The sea doesn't care about your manuals. It only cares about what you do next." His words became unofficial scripture. The Cold War soon demanded a new navy, bigger, faster, nuclear. But the ghost of Okinawa haunted every blueprint. Even the most advanced carriers of the 1950s still bore the fingerprints of those 1945 destroyers. Every redundant system, every sealed bulkhead, every emergency manual tracing out secondary routing, all of it came from the chaos that the kamikazes had forced. The rejected mechanics idea had become the foundation of modern naval architecture, yet progress never comes without resistance. Some officers argued that over-engineering ships made them too heavy, too expensive, too complex. Others countered that survival had no price tag. When the carrier USS Forrestal caught fire in 1967, one rocket igniting a chain reaction of explosions that killed 134 men, investigators found eerie parallels to Okinawa. Their conclusion echoed the same truth. Survival depends on redundancy and human adaptability. The Navy rewrote its training once again. Damage control, school became mandatory for all personnel. Inside those classrooms hung photos of the Laffey burning in the East China Sea, captioned with 4 words: "Preparation saves the ship." What began as desperation in 1945 had evolved into a doctrine that would define every conflict that followed Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf. Whenever a ship survived what should have sunk it, engineers could trace its survival back to those improvised bypasses welded under fire. The principle was now universal: planned for failure, designed for survival, trained for chaos. The men who built that doctrine never saw themselves as heroes. Most of them never made rank. They were welders, pipe fitters, electricians, machinists, the nameless hands that turned panic into system design. When asked years later why they had defied orders, one retired chief replied, "Because the ship didn't care about orders." That sentence captured the soul of the Okinawa generation, men who believed that the difference between bureaucracy and survival was measured in minutes. Today, the modern U.S. Navy still carries their fingerprints. Every fire drill, every watertight door, every emergency pump line, all echo those desperate improvisations. Even in the age of satellites and nuclear propulsion, the lesson remains the same. Technology fails. Training doesn't. In the official naval archives, there is no file titled "The Mechanic Who Saved the Fleet." There never was. But in every destroyer's blueprint, every safety drill, every engineer's log, his idea lives on, unnamed but undefeated. In the end, the kamikaze war wasn't just a clash of steel and fire. It was a test of imagination, the ability to adapt faster than destruction. The Japanese pilots weaponized death. The Americans weaponized learning. And between those two extremes, the future of naval warfare was rewritten. The waves off Okinawa are calm now. The sea that once burned is silent. But beneath its surface, somewhere in the depths, lie fragments of ships, twisted steel, scorched plating, melted guns, remains of a battle that refused to be forgotten. The war ended long ago, yet the lessons born from that inferno still guide every sailor who steps aboard a U.S. warship today. When historians revisit 1945, they often speak of strategy, of generals and admirals, of atomic weapons that ended empires. But the truest revolution, the one that shaped every navy that followed, began not in a conference room, but in the smoke-filled decks of ships like the Laffey and the Hadley. Those destroyers became floating classrooms. Their broken systems, melted wires, and burned-out valves became data. Every pump that failed was analyzed. Every pipe that held was studied. Every decision made under fire was rewritten into doctrine. In 1947, a small team of naval engineers walked the deck of the Laffey for the first time since her repair. They documented every scar, every weld, every unauthorized modification. Their report, now declassified, concluded. These ships survived because they ceased being ships and became living organisms, adapting under pressure, responding to pain, evolving in real time. It wasn't poetic, it was scientific truth. By the 1950s, every American shipyard from Norfolk to Long Beach had adopted redundant routing and localized firefighting as standard design features. But even more importantly, the culture had changed. Commanders were now trained to trust initiative. Damage control wasn't a checklist, it was a mindset. And within that mindset lay the legacy of a mechanic whose name was lost, but whose idea endured. He had believed against orders that a ship should have a second heartbeat, a backup system that could breathe life even when the main one failed. That belief, once heresy, became the soul of the modern Navy. During the Korean War, the destroyer USS Walk took a direct hit from a floating mine off North Korea's coast. Her forward fire main was destroyed instantly. Yet the ship survived because her engineers had rerouted auxiliary lines exactly as the Okinawa veterans had once done. In Vietnam, the USS Forrestal's survivors used the same foam and cross-line procedures, first improvised on Laffey. And in the Persian Gulf, when the USS Stark was hit by 2 Exocet missiles in 1987, her crew saved the ship with identical principles: isolate, reroute, fight, survive. Different wars, same doctrine, same spirit. It became clear, across decades, that the true strength of a navy wasn't in its ships, it was in its people. Every system, every blueprint, every rule was only as strong as the hands that held the hose, the mind that stayed calm, the heart that refused to quit. That's why the U.S. Navy's modern training still begins the same way, in fire and smoke. New sailors crawl through simulated compartments filled with heat and steam. They fight real flames with limited vision and broken equipment. Instructors tell them, "You're not fighting fire, you're fighting panic." They don't realize it, but they're walking the same path as those sailors on the Laffey. In 1975, when the Laffey was finally retired and turned into a museum, many of her surviving crew members returned for the ceremony. Their hair was white now, their uniforms tighter, their voices softer. But when they stepped onto the deck, the memories came back: the roar of engines, the smell of burning oil, the sound of men shouting orders through the smoke. Commander Frederick Beckton, by then a retired rear admiral, stood at the bridge one last time. A reporter asked him if he believed the Laffey had been lucky that day in 1945. He paused. Then he said quietly, "Luck favors the prepared." We weren't lucky, we were ready. The crowd fell silent. That phrase, "we were ready," was later engraved on a brass plaque mounted near the ship's helm. It became a mantra for every generation that followed. Today, naval academies teach it as part of leadership courses. Firefighting manuals quote it in their introductions. Even NASA adopted the same logic when designing the redundant systems of the Apollo spacecraft. Every critical system doubled, every failure anticipated. From destroyers to spacecraft, the legacy of survival spread far beyond the sea. In 1998, a joint study by the Naval Research Laboratory and MIT revisited the Kamikaze campaign's data to test an old question. Did the improvisations truly make a measurable difference? The answer was absolute. Ships that incorporated field modifications before the Okinawa campaign had a 46% higher survival rate than those that did not. The conclusion of the report echoed Taggart's words from half a century earlier. The fleet learned faster than its enemies could kill it. That, in essence, was the American advantage. Not just technology, but the ability to adapt, to learn, to trust the ingenuity of ordinary people under extraordinary pressure. And that may be the truest legacy of all. The Kamikazes believed in sacrifice. The Americans believed in survival. Between those two beliefs, the shape of modern warfare was decided. The flames of Okinawa forged something no weapon could destroy, a culture that valued initiative over obedience, imagination over fear. Today, the USS Laffey rests quietly in Charleston, South Carolina. Tourists walk her decks, unaware that every weld, every pipe, every scorch mark tells a story. If you stand on her stern long enough, you can still see the faint outline of where the fire ate through the steel and where the welders sealed it shut. That line of steel isn't just a scar. It's a signature, a message left by the men who refused to die. War remembers its victories by names and medals, but history remembers survival by lessons. And from the ashes of Okinawa came one of the greatest lessons of all, that courage is not found in defiance of orders, but in the quiet conviction that life, no matter how fragile, is worth fighting for until the very last spark fades.